Okay, in this segment we're going to be talking about what are called trade terms in an import and an export transaction. And what we're referring to when we talk about trade terms are essentially terms that deal with contracts for shipping goods in a sales transaction, and the terms deal with the various issues in the logistical part of shipping. So that would be including who will arrange for transportation, that is, hire a ship, who will make arrangements between the seller and the buyer for payment of the transportation costs, the packaging, the loading. If you're going to have maritime shipping, who's going to load the products onto the ship, or if it's an aircraft, who will be loading onto the aircraft, where will the goods be picked up, where will they be delivered, who will make arrangements for the goods clearing customs and going through any customs procedures, who will be paying the tariffs and taxes when the goods are imported into the country of the buyer, who will be making arrangements for insurance, for cargo, and all of those kinds of issues that are involved in a sales transaction on an international basis. And also, to a degree, these same terms are used domestically as well. So when we talk about trade terms, we are talking about when the buyer takes delivery, who arranges for transportation, where will the payment be made or how will it be made, and that may include letters of credit or a bill or a check or a wire transfer, how that payment will be arranged, what will be the price of the shipping and the transportation and packaging, loading and unloading, delivery, all of that. When will the risk of loss shift? And we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but risk of loss is basically when the seller sells a product and it goes over to the buyer, when does the risk of damage or destruction pass from the seller to the buyer? And who will be paying the costs of freight and insurance? So trade terms are used, were used inconsistently, and in order to help facilitate international trade, the International Chamber of Commerce have put together private trade terms, which are known as Inco Terms right here. Inco Terms stands for the International Chamber of Commerce, and these are trade terms that are commonly used and are basically a baseline that are well defined so that regardless of where you're at in the world, these terms will mean the same thing, and so that can establish uniformity in international sales transactions by utilizing and incorporating these Inco terms into the contract for the sale of the goods that are at issue. So when we talk about Inco terms, they fall into 4 different groups. And just to give you some kind of background, what we're talking about is you have different phases in a sales transaction. The seller and the buyer enter into a contract for the sale and purchase of goods, and so that begins this whole logistical process. So starting at the seller's place of business, if they're a manufacturer or whatever the case may be, the seller then provides the goods to their shipping dock. The goods are picked up typically by a semi-truck or a container truck. The truck then goes to the port of disembarkation, where the ship will be loaded at the port using gantry cranes and stevedores, and then the ship, of course, will sail, and then the ship will arrive in the buyer's country. The goods are then unloaded at the port in the buyer's country, and then at the shipping port, the goods are then transported to the buyer's place of business. So we have this sort of a timeline of different events that are taking place in the logistical supply, and in the background we have these contract terms that are going to spell out as between the seller and the buyer, who will be responsible for payment of the freight, the cost of shipping and packaging and loading, where will the delivery be made from the seller to the buyer, and all of those things at all of these different points of origin. So when we look at the Inco terms, we're looking at basically 4 different categories. First, we have the E terms, which I'll show you more in a minute, but that's basically better for the seller. Then we have the freight terms, or the F terms, carriage terms, the C terms, and then we have D for delivery terms at the place of the buyer. And so these terms basically start with, at this side with the seller, which is the E terms, and then we have the D terms on the other end, which is delivery to the buyer. And then in between, we have these other F and C terms that I'll show you more here in a minute. It'll make a little bit more sense. So one of the questions is, at what point does the liability and carriage transfer from the seller to the buyer? And this is a phrase that is known as passage of the risk. And this is also one of the purposes of the Inco terms, is to clearly delineate when the risk of loss will pass from the seller to the buyer. And when I talk about risk of loss, what I'm talking about is risk of damage or destruction to the goods during transportation, but it also involves who is going to be in charge and responsible for organizing the loading and the transportation itself, who will make arrangements to hire the trucks that will pick up the goods at the seller's manufacturing plant, who will be making arrangements for loading at the port, who will make arrangements for the ship where the container will be loaded, who will be making arrangements at the buyer's end for unloading at the port or the buyer's home country, who will make arrangements for getting the goods to the buyer's door. So the passage of the risk involves not just paying for expenses and who will be responsible in the event the goods are destroyed, but it also relates to all of these in-between steps about making the organizational and logistical arrangements. So passage of the risk basically is the shifting of the responsibility for loss or damage from the seller to the buyer. Once the risk passes from the seller to the buyer is responsible for payment and making arrangements from that point till they have received the products. Now, this is where the Inco terms come in. So let's take a look at this diagram on page 110, or actually before we get there, so this is a general list of the Inco terms that we're going to be discussing, starting with the E term, which is Ex Works. And then we have the free terms, which are free alongside ship and free on board. Then we have the C terms, such as cost, insurance, and freight. And then we have the D terms, which I'm highlighting the ones I want you to know about, delivery, duty paid. So Ex Works, free alongside ship, FAS, free on board, FOB, CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, and finally delivered, duty paid. Now the other ones here are sort of interim, and again it depends on where on this timeline of shipping does the passage of the risk take place. So Ex Works, free terms, the cost, insurance, freight, and finally delivery, duty paid. Those are the main ones I want you to know about. So now let me show you how this works. So this is on page 110. So here we have the seller, their factory, in whatever country it is. And then over on this side we have the buyer in whatever country they're in. So let's just say, for example, we're buying tires from Italy. And we're a tire company. We sell tires like Les Schwab or whatever. So the seller is in Italy, and the buyer is here in Oregon in the United States. So they're going to enter into a sales transaction to buy, let's say, $2 million worth of tires to be delivered to the buyer, and the terms of the delivery will then depend upon what is negotiated between the two parties about who will be making payment and arrangements for transportation. So to begin with, we have EXW, X Works. Right here, EXW. X Works is the most advantageous for the seller. It's the least advantageous, in fact, it's the worst for the buyer. X Works basically means that the goods to be sold will be made available at the seller's place of business. So basically you have a loading dock in the back of their factory. The seller will make those goods available for shipment. X Works. That also carries along with it the responsibility for the buyer to make all of the transportation arrangements along this chain. From the seller's place of business, they have to arrange for trucking or a train or an aircraft to load it. If it's maritime, it's going to go to the harbor. It's going to be loaded onto a ship. It's then going to go to the harbor where the buyer's at, and then it's going to be delivered. It's going to get shipped to the buyer where the buyer is located. So with an X Works transaction, and again, this would be part of the contract, and this is negotiable. And obviously this can have major implications on the price because the cost of shipping can be astronomical if it's even available. The cost of getting goods loaded, there's risk of damage when they're being loaded onto a ship. There's risk of damage when they're being loaded into a container. There's risk of damage during the transportation. Everywhere along this line, there's risk of damage or destruction, and there's also costs involved for all of that. So the seller, if it's X Works, that means that the buyer will have to make all of the arrangements and pay for all of the expenses of transportation and loading and packaging, and the buyer is also going to have to make arrangements to clear customs, to pay all the taxes and duties and other fees and expenses, to have the goods brought through customs, and then finally delivered to the buyer's place of business. So X Works is the most advantageous for the seller, and it's the worst for the buyer, basically. All right, the next one I want you to know about is FAS. Whoops, excuse me here. Oh, I forgot to mention. So when we talk about passage of the risk on this chart, that's the little point where these two lines meet. So X Works passage of the risk will be at the seller's loading dock. So basically the buyer needs to arrange for a truck to pick up the goods. The buyer will have to arrange to have the goods taken off the seller's loading dock and put into the truck, and the buyer assumes all that risk. So risk passes from seller to buyer at the seller's place of business. So next we have FAS, or free alongside ship. This is essentially where the seller will have to make arrangements to transport the goods and package them from the seller's place of business, free alongside ship, to the port. And typically that will mean that the goods are going to be placed within reach of the loading equipment. So if they're going to be using gantry cranes, they'll be placed at the port, and then at that point the passage of the risk changes from the seller to the buyer. The seller will have no further obligation once the goods are delivered to the port and made available to be loaded onto the ship. So that's the FAS, or free alongside ship, Inco term. The next one is very similar, and that is free on board, FOB. And this is one of the more common shipping terms. FOB basically means that the goods are going to be arranged for transportation by the seller from the seller's place of business on board the ship. So that means the seller is going to have to make arrangements to truck the goods or rail car or whatever to the port, and the seller is also going to have to make arrangements and pay for having those goods loaded onto the ship. That's why we call it free on board. And so, again, there's going to be cost involved in that. There's going to be time and expense in making arrangements for the port facility, the stevedores, or whoever's loading onto the ship. Once the goods are loaded onto the ship and secured, then at that point the passage of the risk takes place, and the buyer will be responsible for all of the remaining transportation expense, risk of loss, and all of those other potential costs or expenses that can occur from when they're loaded onto the ship until the buyer finally receives them. So that's the FOB term, or free on board term. Okay. So next we have CIF or CIP, depending on how it's referred to. Cost, insurance, and freight paid. And this essentially can be at any point along this line of transportation. In this case, they say it's right here. Cost, insurance, freight paid to a specific destination, and that will be specified in a contract. And then finally, we have DDP, which is delivery duty paid. And very simply, that is delivery duty paid, the best for the buyer. That means that the seller has the responsibility to pay for all of the costs for all of the shipping and transportation. That also means the seller has the obligation to pay for all of the taxes and customs regulations to get the goods imported into the country where the buyer is located, and make arrangements to have everything delivered to the buyer's doorstep. So DDP, delivery duty paid, is the best for the buyer. So this would be sort of your door-to-door type of transaction from seller to the buyer's door. The seller has to pay for everything. If the goods are damaged during transportation, the seller will have to pay to repair them or resupply with new undamaged goods. And all of the arrangements for customs and clearing and inspections, and all of that has to be arranged by the seller. That's why it's best for the buyer. So Ex Works, again, is best for the seller, and delivery duty paid is best for the buyer. Now, you can imagine, this is why it's very important during the negotiation part of the sales contract that the buyer and the seller are both aware of what these terms mean and where this passage of risk occurs and what obligations each of them are taking on to pay for and make arrangements for the transportation. And this is something, if you're doing import and export, you need to be very familiar with on what these terms mean, because that could be a huge differential in cost that could totally destroy, if you had a profit margin, completely wipe that out. So during the negotiation phase, that's also going to be part of the negotiation. Who's going to pay for what? Where are things going to be delivered? Where will that passage of the risk occur? We talked about freight forwarders in the past. This is also something where a freight forwarder and a customs broker can be beneficial to help make these arrangements. But typically you're going to see either an Ex Works type of contract, an FOB contract, or the delivery duty paid. Those are probably the three most common. And so that's where we have these Inco terms that come into play. Now, we've previously talked about how letters of credit and that sort of thing work. That also plays into this because part of being paid, if you're the seller, part of the obligation of the seller to get paid under a letter of credit is to comply with the terms of the shipping arrangements that are negotiated between the parties. And so that will depend on where the seller's obligations end, because the seller won't be able to get paid until they've made those arrangements and provide proof to the bank as part of the letter of credit process. So if it's the FOB, the seller will have to provide verification that the goods have been loaded on the ship, and at that point, as part of the letter of credit process, that the seller would be paid. So they kind of dovetail in with each other, the use of these Inco terms and the terms of a letter of credit and the sales contract overall. All right, so for purposes of this class, the main ones, again, that I want you to know about, and I have a lot more information in our book, of course, but X works, best for the seller. Best for seller. And delivery duty paid, best for buyer. And then these other ones are in between steps depending on the type of transaction. They also will depend on the mode, if it's going to be maritime, railroad, aircraft, or other mode of transportation. Some of these are limited to air travel or air cargo. Some of them are limited to maritime and waterway transportation only. I'm not really going to get into that here, but basically I want you to have this understanding of what's best for the seller, which is best for the buyer, and this concept of passage of the risk, and when will that turn from the seller to the buyer as part of the use of these Inco terms. So that will be the end of this segment.